right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Goh Han, and I'm from the Singapore Management University. We are very privileged here this afternoon to have with us three very distinguished speakers for the session Context and Fundamentals. So before each of them speak on their respective papers, what I propose to do is, of course, just to introduce them very shortly. Our first speaker today is Mr. Tony Molloy, QC. He has retired as a barrister at the end of January from Shortland Chambers, where he had been the senior New Zealand QC. He remains as an associate member of 10 Square Chambers, Lincoln's Inn. And indeed, he's the only New Zealand practicing lawyer to have been made an honorary member of the Chancery Bar Association. In addition, he's also the co-editor of Trusts and Trustees and the author of several textbooks on tax, fraud, and partnership law. He lectured many years in income tax law and in equity and the law of trusts, wills, and succession, both at the University of Auckland Law School and also at Oxford. Our second speaker this afternoon is Associate Professor Jessica Palmer. She is an Associate Professor at Otago University and teaches courses in contract, equity, and commercial law. She has published numerous articles and book chapters on issues of equity and restitution, and is also an author of Equity and Trusts in New Zealand. Jessica was also a member of the reference group assisting the New Zealand Law Commission in its recent review of the law of trusts.
It was a solitary slide. Have you got it or not? You have? Oh, maybe not. Well, oh, there you are. That's it. It's self-explanatory. This morning, Justice Lowe, in his address, referred to Singapore's aspirations to be a centre that's open to new ways of thinking and able to bridge unbridgeable chasms. And I hope that Singapore succeeds in this, because even more than it has done so far, because when it comes to trusts as the premier wealth protection device, there is a lot of testing time ahead. And it's to do with this inequality that Thomas Piketty, a professor in Paris who wrote a book that Larry Summers says is Nobel Prize worthy, that was translated last year into English and published by Harvard and has sold a vast number of copies. What it says is that R is the rate of growth on substantial wealth. G is the rate of growth in the economy. If you're a wage earner, you're an academic on a salary or whatever, you can't expect, if growth in the economy is 1%, to be getting 10% annual wage increases. On the other hand, R, if you're Bill Gates, last year, he started the year with about $72 billion. He gave away $1.8 billion to charities that he supports. He ended the year with $77 billion. Great wealth like this is routinely pulling in those kinds of returns, 10, 12, 15%. And the result of that is that while everyone else is languishing and getting nowhere, the super rich are a diminishing group right at the top. There was a time when the worry was about the 10%. The worry now is the rate at which the top 0.301% are racing away from everybody else. And the trouble with it is that when you've got so much of the world's wealth, I think it's the top I have a paper on this that you'll no doubt get. I think it's the top 60-odd people in England have got the same amount of money as A, the GDP of Russia, and B, the bottom 30 or 40% of the population. Now, when there is that amount of wealth, and so many are going nowhere, and this wealth is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The problem with the super rich is they don't have, by the time you've got a super yacht that's a year old and another one being built, and a couple of Lamborghinis and a couple of Ferraris and 3 or 4 country houses, you're really worried about how the hell you're going to spend some of this stuff. And of course you can't. You can only spend 3/5 or 5/8 of the proverbial of it. And so you just go on getting richer, damn it. And it's a real problem. But what they're doing, because they don't spend it, they just turn it over at the same sort of rates of return on capital. The world's wealth is being hoovered up into a sort of black hole. And in the meantime, all the economies in the world, somebody mentioned this morning, I think, that the Singapore growth rate was only, might have been at lunch, 1.5% or 2%. And that's going to be pretty good. Thomas Piketty says that 1.5 is going to be as good as anybody's going to do by the time that China's settled down. And when you've got that, very, very little growth, one of the reasons for it is there's a huge lack of demand, because the people on the bottom are really on the bottom, and they spend every damn thing they earn. They're not well paid. In order to have a life, particularly now with house price inflation and all of that sort of thing, they're really absolutely stretched. And there's darn all money for discretionary spending. So what happens then? Businesses collapse because there's enough people in the world, but they haven't got enough money. Now, the way Piketty goes back to the French Revolution, when things were a little lopsided then too, and they did a little bit of lopping of another sort, and they sorted that out. And for a while, things sort of came back. You then had the Belle Epoque and the sort of Gilded Age in the United States with the Vanderbilts and all of those people prior to World War I, and they were off again, getting towards the position we're now in. And then, mercifully, World War I intervened and destroyed the investments of many of them. And the world sort of came back, or started to swing back. Then we hit the Depression. Roosevelt started out the right way with what we'd call quantitative easing, and then he lost his nerve. And what he had started and looked promising, as I say, he lost his nerve and things started to go back out of control until the most magnificent public works employment scheme of the century then occurred. It was called World War II, and the amount of work that had to go in to that, plus the destruction that it did for those people rich people whose investments had started to accrue again, equalized everything again somewhat. We then had about 30-odd years when the world really was a relatively prosperous place. People weren't rich by today's standards, and I can just talk about how it was growing up as a kid in New Zealand, but with a father who'd come back from war service, and because of that he missed out on university, he was on low pay. He had one kid when he got back from the war, it was me, but he, over the next few years, had 8. I don't remember us, I suppose looking back, we must have been poor, but it didn't feel like that. Every house in our street, which was only a gravel road, backing onto dairy farms in what's now a suburb of Auckland. But every house in that street was actually owned by the people who lived in it. And it was quite a long street, and there were only about 3 or 4 cars owned by people in that street. And yet, you know, it was a comfortable life, and you felt that you could do anything. You weren't conscious that you were on the bottom of the heap. And society was gentler, kinder, and probably rather nicer than it is today. And then Thatcher and Reagan came along, and there was a bloke called Laffer in the States with this Laffer curve, where he drew talking to Reagan one day, and he said, you know, you've got to slash taxes because the rich are the wealth creators. Well, that's a fallacy, of course. They're the wealth accumulators, but they're not the creators. The creators are the people who actually spend all their money in the businesses and keep the businesses going. But he said they're the wealth creators, and he drew a sort of inverted U-clause curve, and he said, now, Ron, you know, when it gets to the top, and that's at a pretty low level, he said, all of these guys are going to say, to hell with working anymore, we're just going to go to the beach and, you know, we won't run our businesses or anything like that. Now, Warren Buffett's a bit more honest because he says that he, like Bill Gates and George Soros, 3 of the top half dozen in the world richest stakes, they say, look, Buffett particularly says, firstly, he's very annoyed because he makes billions a year and he pays his secretary presumably well, but presumably maybe she gets in early 6 figures. I don't know. I don't know what a secretary gets even to Warren Buffett, but it's still a secretary's wage. She pays twice the effective tax rate on her secretary's wage that Buffett pays on his millions, or billions a year. And he says this is wrong. And Gates says it's wrong. Soros says it's wrong. A lot of them say this is actually going to wreck the world's economy, and it is wrecking it. So, but the trouble is, and this is where Justice Lowe this morning was talking about the unbridgeable chasm, and it put me in mind of what Lee Kuan Yew wrote in his wonderful autobiography a few years ago. He talked about when the British left and took their garrison, 60% of your economy here walked with it, with the British. It went. And Lee said that he had to sit down and think about what do we have. And basically it's a bit of dirt, not very big, and about the size of a dairy farm in some parts of Australia, and a small dairy farm in some parts of Australia. And we're right on the world shipping lanes. So we've got to be able to turn that into something. We've got location, that's something. But it's not enough on its own. Can't just advertise and say we've got a great location. Come here, and people find it's the size of a small dairy farm in Australia. They wonder what you're talking about. But so another thing he said we had to have is integrity. We're going to be a world financial centre, and the integrity has to be rock solid. And he set out to build this. Now, one of the people who was a big supporter of the Conservative Party in England at that stage was a guy called Jim Slater, who with a fellow called Walker had a merchant bank called Slater Walker. And Mr. Lee said, I thought these guys were crooks. I thought Slater was a crook anyway. And he'd been doing a bit of work in Singapore. And he decided that he would issue a warrant for Slater's arrest, so that if he turned up here, Singapore would put him in the slammer and say, look, you do what this guy does, and this is where you'll end up, so don't do it. And the Brits apparently tried to come down on him like a ton of bricks, and he resisted. And he was dead right, and he was very far-sighted. And a few years later, a couple of blokes called Hodgson and Raw wrote a book that explained exactly what these fellows had done, and it was really dirty work. And Lee saw it for what it was, and called it for what it was, and he wasn't scared to do it, because he put integrity ahead of greasing up to the Brits and he thought that would pay off, and it has. But the trouble is, today as then, the lack of integrity in public life is the most serious obstacle to peace, order, and good governance in our economies and in our countries. And what we have Starbucks in England, for example, hasn't been paying tax. Apparently, it pays a donation of $20 million to the British Revenue, and HMRC accepts this and doesn't investigate them. Now, the day when you can call a tax an optional payment like that, a sort of gift, it just hasn't dawned. A tax is a compulsory exaction. Those guys, that was a bribe. And that happened relatively recently. HMRC has decided not to prosecute any of the people who've been rumbled in the HSBC scandal that's been going on over there. Again, it's upside down. And the trouble is, of course, that no one standing for Parliament in the United States or in the UK is going to do anything to annoy the rich. They may not grease up to them overtly and beg for donations, but they certainly don't want them making donations to their opponents, who could then outspend them and get elected. So Lee was bang on the money with what had to be done. The only way out of this, Piketty says, is that these high rates of tax have got to come back. And Sir Anthony Atkinson has just written a magnificent book. He's been at the game of inequality as an economist for twice the time Piketty has been. And he was doing it long before it became fashionable. And he's just published his 50th book. And he's got a prescription of about 15 things that have to be done. It's called Inequality, What Must Be Done, or What Are We Able to Do? It was published about a month ago. Again, Harvard University Press snaffled it, as they did with Piketty. But he's calling for 70% tax rates for, is that seconds or minutes? 10 seconds, is it? Minutes, oh, okay. I am trying to speak fast. He wants to go back. I mean, the tax rates that for the inheritance tax or whatever it was, I think they were up in the 90s. I think in the UK. But he said they really got to come back although he would bring them in as a gift tax or a transaction tax where the stuff is being settled. He would tax it at that stage and tax it very heavily. And income tax, again, high rates for the very high incomes. And Piketty would go further. He would say 80% is about the right kind of rate. And he said, this is the price, Piketty says in his book, which is a marvelous read. It must have been, the book must have been brilliantly written in French, because Arthur Goldhammer's translation into English is, it is just such a pleasure to read. It's 400 or 500 pages, but you can, it's a page turner, it really is. Piketty would have gone further. He'd say about 80% would be about the right top-end tax rate, and he would go for really, he said the real problem is with the inheritances. They are the things that must be demolished at the extent to which they now have reached. It's okay to be able to leave, 20 million to your kids or 50 million or something like that, but 50 billion is just off the planet, and that should simply be confiscated at some point, either at gift point or at succession point, and simply taken into the public purse. You've then got 60, 70% of your population who are not earning enough to have any discretionary spending to spend with the businesses that are trying to eke a living out around the world. So if you do that, you can do things like, for example, create a minimum wage which people must have. Now, it's very difficult to do that by saying that businesses have got to pay a certain minimum because the businesses are struggling too. So the way to do it is with this money to use it to pay a supplement to people to build up their wages, which they will entirely spend. And those of you who know anything about economics know there's a concept called the multiplier. And if you put $10 into the economy and 10 people have it and they go out and spend it, that then spreads. The businesses they spend it at, each of them has got more money to spend on stock, on whatever. It multiplies. And the idea is to catch that multiplier effect. Now, to do all this, you can't leave trusts to just go on taking this sort of stuff out of, protecting wealth from serving public purposes. The wealth has reached the point where it's just too much. There is also the problem of the so-called rentier, the CEO who chooses the board, big financial company. I mean, the guy, I think, who ran Lehman's into the ground got a terminal bonus of $500 million, I think. And Robert Reich, who was Clinton's Treasury Secretary, has written a book from which I quote in the Aftershock, The Next Economy and America's Future, which I refer to in the book. But he says, look, if you take that 500 million, even if it had been 100 million, say, it may have had to pay some tax on it. After Reagan, it wasn't much, but maybe 10 million. So there's still 90 there. Okay, give this guy, the CEO, 10 million for running the company into the ground. And then instead of him having the other 80 to just tie it up with G, distribute it among, might be 10,000 people in the company. Distribute that 80 million to them and then see what happens, because they will spend it, he won't. So you get spending back into the economy starts moving, you start to break down equality. Now, if you don't break down equality, the point will be reached quite clearly when there are so few at the top and so much of the rest of us that it doesn't take many of the rest of us to make life very, very intolerable for the few at the top. The French Revolution is an example. The revolution in England in 1832, when people were being denied the vote, and they started burning down the houses of the nobility, who then started reflecting on the French Revolution. You have, at every step, there are, I mean, the latest one, how many, and this is the thing, you don't need sort of real revolutions these days in the sense of people on the streets. How many very angry people did it take to kill 3,000 people on 9/11 and crash 4 jets that they hijacked? It was only a handful of people, and they can do that much damage. There aren't 3,000 multi-billionaires in the world. They took that number of people out in a few hours. And you don't even have to hijack a jet now, because you can buy a drone for about $1,000 with guns on it. 2,500 of those, and you can do all the billionaires in the world in an afternoon if you are well enough organised. So the point is, Piketty is saying, look, we have the option of oligarchy or of doing, and probably anarchy, or doing something about this. You just can't have the lopsidedness anymore. And apart from that, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is worth a read sometimes. It says all human beings are born with equal and unalienable rights. Recognition of inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And it goes on. Everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and is entitled to realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. And it goes on and on and on. Professor Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, says that the super rich don't exist in a vacuum. They need a functioning society around them in order to be able to live decently and properly themselves. David Hume says, where the riches are engrossed by a few, these must contribute very largely to the supply of the public necessities. Adam Smith, what improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconveniency to the whole. No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far the greater part of the members are poor and miserable. And Lord Beveridge, in his great book on full employment in a free society, on the front page he inscribes this 3 words, misery generates hate. And then President Kennedy's inaugural address, if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. The only thing one can predict about the high-end trust, not talking about the bread and butter trusts of the local barber or whatever, the high-end trusts, which of course we all like to have coming across our desks, those things, it's either they're doomed or we're doomed, I suspect. I don't know whether it's that bad, but I don't want to ruin the conference on the first day. But the reason I retired as of January is no reason I couldn't have kept going, but I have really got so intrigued by this that you can't find politicians who want to face it. There's so many strands to pull together that I'm going to spend the next 3 or 4 years trying to understand it myself. I have any idea what the outcome of that will be or whether Oxford University Press will think it's worth publishing at the end of that. But it's a super serious problem. And I'm sorry to drop it on you just as you were thinking you just cracked the code for making high-end trust even more effective, but I think you better read this anyway as a sort of sobriety test before you get carried away by doing too much more of what you've been doing so well already.